When I first met Angela Mancini, it felt like a storm rolling in on a quiet day, unexpected and impossible to ignore. She was standing in the corner of Salvatore Genovese's private party, the type of gathering where everyone's either kissing up or plotting. Angela wasn't like the others, though. She had this sharp confidence about her, a glint in her eye that said she didn't just belong there, she could own the whole room if she wanted. I'd been through plenty by then, fights, betrayals, near misses, but nothing could have prepared me for her. Marco Costa, my closest friend since we were kids running schemes on the streets of Chicago, noticed her too. How could he not? Marco and I had built our lives side by side, climbing the ranks of the family, doing whatever Salvatore needed to keep our names solid and our pockets full. We had each other's backs, no matter what. But Angela, she started to wedge herself between us before I even realized it was happening. At first, it was harmless. I talked to her at these parties, learning more about her than I probably should have. She was Salvatore's niece, visiting from Sicily, sharp as a blade and just as dangerous. I was drawn to her mind as much as her beauty. It wasn't long before I was making excuses to see her, to talk to her. Marco didn't say much about it at first, but I could see the way he watched her too. I should have known then that this was heading for trouble. The first real crack in things came during a job. We were supposed to handle a shipment coming in from the docks, an important run for Salvatore. Marco and I had always been in sync, but that night, something was off. He was distracted, and I caught him looking at me like I was the enemy. We pulled it off, but barely, and later, I confronted him about it. "What's your problem, Marco?" I asked, cornering him outside the warehouse. He shrugged, lighting a cigarette like he couldn't care less. "No problem. Just wondering when you're gonna admit you think she's yours." "She?" I played dumb, but we both knew who he meant. He laughed bitterly and walked off, leaving me stewing. The thing is, he wasn't wrong. I did think Angela was mine, or at least, I wanted her to be. But Marco wasn't the type to back down, especially not when it came to something he wanted. It turned everything between us into a slow-burning fuse. The next few weeks were a mess. Every time I saw Angela, I couldn't help myself. She was magnetic, pulling me in even when I knew I should stay away. And Marco? He started doing the same. It was like we were stuck in this unspoken battle, each of us trying to win her over while pretending nothing was wrong. She must have known, but Angela played it cool, like she was above it all. Maybe she enjoyed the chaos. Who knows? Things reached their breaking point at another one of Salvatore's parties. Marco had been drinking and I could see it in his eyes. He was ready to throw down. Angela had barely arrived when Marco stormed over to me. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat, his voice low but dangerous. I tried to calm him down, but it was too late. He threw the first punch and everything exploded. We were rolling on the floor, fists flying, years of brotherhood crumbling in front of everyone. Salvatore himself had to pull us apart, furious and disgusted. "I don't care what this is about," he growled. "Fix it or I'll bury you both." The ride back that night was silent. Angela sat between us in the car, her expression unreadable. When we dropped her off, she paused at the door, looking at both of us. "You've ruined everything," she said quietly. "You don't even see it, do you?" That hit harder than any punch. Marco and I didn't speak for days after that. The family could smell the tension, and it didn't take long for rivals to start circling. We were too distracted to hold things together, and Salvatore wasn't about to let his empire crumble because of us. He stripped us of our roles, handing them to men who hadn't spent their lives earning them like we had. Angela? She disappeared. Maybe she went back to Sicily, or maybe she just decided we weren't worth the trouble anymore. I never got the chance to ask. Marco and we tried to patch things up, but it was never the same. We'd built everything together, but one woman was all it took to tear it down. Looking back, I don't even know if it was love or pride that destroyed us. Probably both. What I do know is this. In our world, you can survive almost anything, except betrayal. Even if it comes from someone you thought was family. It's strange how quickly something as solid as a lifelong friendship can start to crumble. Marco and I tried to act like things were normal after that night, but we both knew it wasn't. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, with resentment we weren't ready to admit. Still, we kept going through the motions, pretending the cracks weren't there. Angela was the reason for everything. I couldn't stop thinking about her, no matter how much I tried to focus on business. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when she looked at you, and I guess that was the problem. Marco felt it too. Neither of us could let it go. I thought I could win her over with honesty. I was direct, told her how I felt, and didn't play games. When we talked, it was real. I wanted her to know she could trust me, that I wasn't just trying to impress her. But Marco, he had a different approach. He threw money around like it didn't matter, buying her things I couldn't compete with. Jewelry, designer dresses, even a little sports car that turned heads when she drove it down Michigan Avenue. And she accepted it all, smiling in that way that made me wonder what she was thinking. It wasn't long before our rivalry became impossible to hide. The guys in the crew started whispering about it, making bets on who Angela would choose. Even Salvatore noticed. One night, he pulled me aside during a meeting. "Whatever this thing is between you and Marco, end it," he warned, his voice low and sharp. "It's bad for business." I nodded, but I didn't mean it. How could I let it go? It wasn't just about Angela. It was about pride, about proving I was better than Marco in something, anything. And I knew Marco felt the same. Things hit a boiling point on a Saturday night. Angela invited us both to the same restaurant, some fancy place downtown where the wine cost more than most people's rent. I think she wanted to see how far we'd go, how much we'd fight for her. Marco and I sat across from each other, forced to play nice while she looked on with that amused smile of hers. "So," Marco said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the place, "Angela tells me she's thinking about taking a trip to Europe. Paris, Rome, maybe Sicily." I clenched my jaw. I knew where this was going. "Sounds nice," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I'm sure she could use a break." "She could," Marco agreed, smirking. "That's why I'm sending her. First-class tickets, 5-star hotels. Nothing but the best." Angela tilted her head, watching me, waiting to see how I'd respond. My blood boiled, but I forced a smile. "You always did like to show off," I said, my voice tight. "But Angela's not the type to be bought, are you?" She laughed softly, swirling her wine. "You two are unbelievable," she said, her eyes sparkling. "It's like a game to you." "It's not a game," I said, my gaze locked on hers. "At least, not to me." Marco leaned forward, his smirk fading. "Is that right?" "Yeah," I said, my voice low but firm. "That's right." The rest of the night was a blur of tense silences and cutting remarks. By the time we left, the lines had been drawn. This wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about everything we'd been bottling up over the years. Who was smarter, who was stronger, who deserved more. Angela was just the spark that lit the fire. Over the next few weeks, things spiraled out of control. Marco started making moves behind my back, trying to push me out of deals we'd been working on for years. I retaliated, cutting him out of a couple of jobs and making sure he knew it. The crew started taking sides, and before long, the tension spread through the whole operation. Angela, meanwhile, seemed to enjoy the chaos. She'd call me late at night, her voice soft and teasing, asking me to meet her. I always went, even when I knew I shouldn't. I'd show up at her apartment, and she'd greet me with that smile, her hair falling loose over her shoulders. For a little while, I'd forget about Marco, forget about everything but her. But it never lasted. As soon as I left, the reality would hit me. Marco was probably doing the same thing, playing the same game, thinking he was the one she'd choose in the end. And the truth was she wasn't going to choose either of us. She didn't need to. She had us both wrapped around her finger, and she knew it. One night, after too many drinks, Marco showed up at my place. He banged on the door until I let him in, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he spat, his words slurred. "I don't think," I said, meeting his glare. "I know." He lunged at me, and we ended up in a fistfight right there in my living room, smashing furniture and yelling like a couple of idiots. By the time it was over, we were both bleeding and out of breath, but nothing had been resolved. If anything, we hated each other more. That was the moment I realized there was no going back. The friendship we'd built, The empire we'd fought for, it was all falling apart, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Angela was the catalyst, but the cracks had been there all along. We just hadn't wanted to see them. And now it was too late. It was Angela who started pulling me in closer, not the other way around, at least that's how I saw it. I didn't change much. I kept being myself, kept treating her with the same mix of honesty and respect I thought she deserved. But something shifted. She started calling more often, asking me to meet her in quiet places where we could talk. Real talk, not the kind of shallow stuff Marco was always throwing around. She'd tell me things about her life back in Sicily, about her father, about how she sometimes felt trapped by the weight of her name. It felt real. Genuine. For a while, I thought maybe I was imagining it, that connection between us. But then she reached for my hand one night, her fingers lingering just long enough to make it clear. Angela wasn't just playing me. She wasn't playing anyone, not this time. She saw something in me and she trusted it. Marco didn't miss a thing. He saw the way she looked at me, how she laughed at my jokes in a way she didn't with him. It ate at him. The more Angela drifted toward me, the more Marco started to unravel. He wasn't the smooth, confident guy I'd known all my life. He was jumpy, paranoid, watching my every move like he was waiting for me to stab him in the back. One night, Angela and I were out for a walk along the river. It was late, the kind of quiet that made the city feel like ours alone. She told me she felt safe with me, like she could finally breathe. I didn't say much, I didn't have to. Just hearing her say that was enough. But as I walked her home, I felt a shadow on my back, a weight that told me we weren't as alone as we thought. The next day, Marco confronted me in the back room of one of Salvatore's clubs. His face was red, his fists clenched at his sides. "What's going on between you two?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. I played dumb. "What are you talking about?" "Don't give me that," he snapped. "I've seen the way she looks at you." "I'm not blind, Vincenzo." I sighed, trying to keep my temper in check. "Marco, you're making something out of nothing." "Nothing?" he barked, stepping closer. "You think I don't know you've been sneaking around with her?" "I haven't been sneaking around," I said, my voice steady. "And if she wants to talk to me, that's her choice, not mine." That was the wrong thing to say. Marco shoved me against the wall, his face inches from mine. "You're supposed to be my friend," he hissed. "Friends don't do this. Friends don't try to buy love," I shot back, shoving him off me. "Maybe that's your problem." For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. But then he just stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes full of something I hadn't seen before, hurt. He turned and stormed out, leaving me there to wonder if we just crossed a line we couldn't come back from. After that, Marco started spiraling. He'd show up to meetings late, snapping at the guys for no reason. Word got back to me that he'd been drinking more, picking fights over nothing. Salvatore noticed too, and he wasn't happy. "Marco's losing it," Salvatore said to me one night, his voice low and dangerous. "If he doesn't get his head straight, he's going to be a liability." I didn't say anything. What could I say? Marco was my best friend, but he was also unraveling right in front of me, and I didn't know how to stop it. Angela, meanwhile, kept trying to pull me closer, like she didn't notice the storm brewing around us, or maybe she didn't care. She'd call late at night, her voice soft and inviting, asking me to meet her. Every time, I told myself I should say no, but I never did. I'd show up, and for a little while, it felt like the world outside didn't matter. But it did matter. It mattered a lot. One night, Angela asked me what I wanted from her, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just want you to be happy." She smiled, but there was something sad about it. "You're the only one who says that." I wanted to believe that was enough, that I could be the one to make her happy. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing in our world ever was. Marco's behavior kept getting worse. He started showing up uninvited, to places he knew Angela and I might be. At first, he just watched, his eyes cold and accusing. But then he started confronting her, demanding answers. I wasn't there the first time it happened, but Angela told me later, her hands trembling as she lit a cigarette. "He's losing control," she said, exhaling a stream of smoke. "You need to talk to him, Vincenzo." I nodded, but I wasn't sure talking would do any good. Marco wasn't the type to back down, not when he felt cornered. And he definitely felt cornered now. The tension finally boiled over one night at the club. Marco walked in, his face dark with anger, and marched straight up to me. "This ends now," he growled. "You and Angela, whatever you think this is, it's done." I stood up, my jaw tight. "That's not your call to make." "She's mine," he spat, his voice shaking. "She's always been mine." "No, Marco," I said, my voice calm but firm. "She's not. And she never was." His fist connected with my jaw before I even saw it coming. The room exploded into chaos as the guys tried to pull us apart. I could hear Angela yelling, her voice breaking through the noise, but it didn't matter. Marco and I weren't just fighting each other, we were fighting for everything we thought we'd built, everything we were about to lose. Angela's words hit me like a freight train. I still remember the way she looked at me that night, her eyes wide, searching mine for some kind of reaction. It was late, the kind of quiet Chicago night where even the city seemed to hold its breath. We were alone in her apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp casting shadows on the walls. "I love you, Vincenzo," she said, her voice trembling just enough to tell me how hard it was for her to say it. For a moment, I couldn't speak. All the thoughts I'd been shoving down for weeks, months, really rushed to the surface. I wanted to believe her. No, I needed to believe her. But this wasn't just a confession of love, it was a spark in a powder keg. "Are you sure?" I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She nodded, stepping closer. "I've never been more sure of anything." "But, Vincenzo..." Her voice broke off, and she looked away for a moment before meeting my gaze again. "If Marco finds out..." I didn't let her finish. "Marco's not going to find out," I said firmly. "He doesn't need to know." She didn't look convinced. "You don't understand. He's not thinking straight anymore. He's dangerous. I've seen the way he talks about you, the way he looks at me. He's losing control, Vincenzo." I knew she was right. Marco had been spiraling for weeks, and the worse things got between us, the more unpredictable he became. But hearing Angela say it out loud, hearing her admit that she was afraid of him, made the situation feel even more real. "Let me worry about Marco," I said, stepping closer. "You don't have to deal with him anymore." Her hand found mine, and I could feel it trembling. "I don't want anything to happen to you," she whispered. I couldn't help but smile, despite the weight of what she was saying. "I've been through worse. Marco's not going to scare me off." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about courage. Marco wasn't some rival we could outmaneuver or a deal gone bad that we could fix with money and muscle. He was my oldest friend, the guy who'd been there through everything. And now? Now he was the biggest threat to the one thing I couldn't let go of. Angela leaned into me, her head resting against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, letting the moment stretch out longer than it should have. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something close to peace. But it didn't last. It couldn't. The next day, Marco showed up unannounced at the warehouse. I could tell right away that something was off. His movements were too sharp, his voice a little too loud, like he was trying to prove he was still in control. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes narrowing. I nodded, leading him into the office. As soon as the door closed, he turned to face me, his fists clenched at his sides. "I know something's going on," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you've been seeing her." Kept my face blank. "Seeing who?" "Don't play dumb, Vincenzo," he snapped. "You think I don't know about you and Angela? You think I don't see the way she looks at you?" I didn't say anything. What was there to say? Denying it would only make him angrier, and admitting it would be like lighting a match. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice shaking. "You were supposed to be my brother, and you went behind my back." "Marco, listen to me," I said, keeping my voice steady. "This isn't about you or me. Angela." "Don't say her name," he shouted, slamming his fist against the desk. "You don't get to say her name." For a moment I thought he might hit me. The tension in the room was suffocating, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get ready for a fight. But then he stepped back, his face twisting into something almost unrecognizable. "You think you've won," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less menacing. You think she chose you? Marco, this isn't about winning, I said, trying to calm him down. This isn't a game. Yes, it is, he hissed. And you just turned it into something neither of us can walk away from. He left before I could say anything else, slamming the door so hard that the glass rattled in its frame. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, staring at the desk and wondering how the hell we'd gotten here. That night, Angela called me again. I didn't tell her about the confrontation with Marco. She already had enough to worry about, and the last thing I wanted was to make her feel like she was caught in the middle of something she couldn't control. We'll figure this out, I told her, my voice as steady as I could make it. I promise. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the promise I'd just made was one I wouldn't be able to keep. Marco wasn't going to back down, and neither was I. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was only one way this was going to end. It was Marco's disappearance that changed everything. One day he was there, seething with anger, making threats he couldn't take back, and the next, he was gone. At first, I thought it was just another one of his outbursts, that he'd taken off to cool down somewhere. He'd done it before, back when things got heated. But this time felt different. His phone went straight to voicemail. No one in the crew had seen him. Even Salvatore was quiet about it, his usual commanding tone replaced by a vague shrug when I asked about Marco. He had personal issues, Salvatore said, his eyes cold and distant. Sometimes, people can't handle the pressure of this life. I didn't believe him. Salvatore wasn't the kind of man to let someone walk away without a reason, especially not someone like Marco, who knew too much. But questioning him wasn't an option, not if I wanted to keep my own head. The days turned into weeks, and the absence started to feel permanent. The tension that had hung over everything was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence. Angela seemed relieved, though she tried to hide it. I caught her once, sitting on her balcony with a glass of wine, staring out at the city like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. Do you think he'll come back? I asked her one night, my voice barely louder than the hum of the city below. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. No, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. I don't think he will. There was something in the way she said it that stuck with me. She sounded so sure, so final, like she knew more than she was letting on. I didn't press her about it, though. Part of me didn't want to know. It wasn't until much later that I started hearing whispers. They came from the shadows, from the corners where people thought no one was listening. Marco's name, spoken in hushed tones, followed by words that made my stomach turn. They said Salvatore had found out about him, about the part of Marco's life he'd always kept hidden. And in our world, there was no forgiveness for that. I didn't want to believe it. Marco was my friend, my brother. We'd been through everything together, and I thought I knew him better than anyone. But the pieces started to fit together too well. The paranoia, the outbursts, the way he'd been pulling away long before Angela came into the picture. It all made sense in a way I wished it didn't. The whispers didn't stop there. They said someone had tipped Salvatore off, someone who wanted Marco out of the way. I told myself it wasn't true, that Marco had made too many enemies and someone else had used it against him. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind, a dark, ugly suspicion I couldn't shake. Angela noticed the change in me. You've been quiet, she said one night, her hand resting on mine. Just thinking, I replied, trying to keep my voice even. About Marco? She asked, her tone careful. Yeah, I admitted. It doesn't make sense. One day he's here, and the next he's gone. It's not like him. Angela didn't say anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost hesitant. Sometimes people get themselves into situations they can't get out of. You know how this life is, Vincenzo. It doesn't leave room for mistakes. Her words hit me harder than I expected. You think he made a mistake? I think. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I think Marco was troubled. And sometimes, trouble catches up with you. I studied her face, searching for something, anything, that would give her away. But Angela was as unreadable as ever, her expression a perfect mask. If she knew more than she was saying, she wasn't letting it show. The weeks dragged on, and the whispers faded, replaced by new rumors and new drama. Life in the family moved on as it always did. Salvatore gave me more responsibility, saying he trusted me to keep things steady after Marco's departure. But every time I walked into the warehouse, every time I sat at the table where Marco's chair now sat empty, I felt the loss like a knife in my gut. And Angela stayed by my side through it all. She'd lean on my shoulder, tell me how proud she was of me, how much she loved me. I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But there was a part of me that couldn't let go of that suspicion, that nagging thought that maybe she'd done something to protect me, something I wouldn't have been able to forgive. I never asked her outright. Some questions are better left unanswered. But sometimes, late at night, I'd catch her staring into the distance, her face shadowed with something I couldn't name. And in those moments, I'd wonder if she ever thought about Marco, if she ever regretted whatever role she might have played in his disappearance. In the end, Marco became a ghost, a memory that haunted the edges of my life but never stepped into the light. I told myself it was better this way, that he was gone because he had to be, because it was the only way things could move forward. But deep down I knew the truth. Marco didn't just disappear. Someone made sure he was gone. And whoever it was, they took a piece of me with him.